The wind carried ash through the narrow streets of Ravenhill, a perpetual reminder that winter here was not merely cold, but cruel. The mountain town clung to the northern cliffs like a wounded animal refusing to fall. Its gray stone buildings stacked haphazardly against the slope, connected by frozen pathways that turned treacherous after dark. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin, desperate columns, as if even the fire knew better than to burn too boldly in a place like this. The sky hung low and colorless, pressing down on the rooftops with the weight of centuries, and in the distance, the jagged peaks of the Frostbite Range cut into the horizon like broken teeth. Ayla Morgan had learned long ago not to look at those mountains for too long. They reminded her of things she had tried to bury. She kept her eyes on her work instead, on the cracked wooden floor of the infirmary, on the threadbare blankets she folded each morning, on the hands of the sick and injured who came through the door seeking help she could barely provide. The infirmary was a single-room structure on the eastern edge of town, wedged between a butcher's shop that reeked of old blood and a boarding house where the walls were so thin you could hear every argument, every sob, every desperate coupling in the night. The building itself was older than anyone could remember, its foundation stones worn smooth by time and neglect, its roof patched with mismatched shingles that leaked when the snow melted. Inside, the air always smelled of herbs and sickness, of lye soap and something deeper, something rotten that no amount of scrubbing could ever quite remove. She had been working there for 2 years now, ever since she had arrived in Ravenhill with nothing but the clothes on her back and a terror in her chest that made it hard to breathe. The healer who had hired her, old Marta, had asked no questions. She had simply looked at Ayla with eyes that had seen too much suffering to be surprised by one more broken girl and said, "You know how to clean a wound?" Ayla had nodded. "Then you can stay." It was the first kindness anyone had shown her in months, and even now, the memory of it brought a tightness to her throat. Marta had died 6 months ago, her lungs finally giving out after years of breathing the damp, moldy air of the infirmary. She had passed quietly in her sleep, and Ayla had found her in the morning, cold and stiff in the narrow cot behind the supply cabinet. There had been no ceremony, no mourning. The town council had allowed Ayla to continue running the infirmary only because no one else wanted the job, and because the alternative was to let the building sit empty, which would have been an admission that Ravenhill had given up entirely on caring for its weakest. So Ayla stayed. She cleaned wounds and set broken bones and dispensed what little medicine she could afford to buy from the traveling merchants who came through once a month. She did not complain. She had learned long ago that complaint was a luxury reserved for those who had someone to listen. The people of Ravenhill did not trust her. She was human, and this was a town built on the uneasy coexistence of werewolf clans who barely tolerated each other, let alone outsiders. The clans operated under a fragile system of laws and hierarchies, all of them ultimately answerable to the king in the distant capital. But here in the mountains, the law was interpreted loosely and enforced selectively. Humans like Ayla existed on the margins, useful for labor too menial or dangerous for the wolves to bother with, but never truly welcome. She felt their eyes on her whenever she walked through the market square, felt the weight of their suspicion and disdain. Some of them thought she was a runaway. Others thought she was a spy. A few of the older women muttered that she carried bad luck, that Marta had died because Ayla had brought some curse with her from wherever she had come. Ayla let them think what they wanted. It was easier than trying to explain the truth, which was that she had fled something far worse than any curse they could imagine. She did not speak of her past, not to anyone. The memories lived inside her like shards of glass, cutting her whenever she moved too quickly or let her guard down. She had grown up in a small settlement 3 days' ride to the south, a place so insignificant it did not even have a name, just a collection of houses along a dirt road that connected 2 larger towns. Her parents had died when she was 6, her mother from fever and her father from an accident in the logging camp where he worked. After that, she had been passed from household to household, always the extra mouth to feed, always the one who slept in the corner and ate last and wore clothes that did not fit. By the time she was 14, she had learned to make herself invisible, to move through rooms without making a sound, to anticipate what people wanted before they asked. It was a survival skill, and it had served her well until the day it had not. His name had been Gregor. He had been the head of the household where she had lived from age 15 to 20, a blacksmith with a reputation for quality work and a temper that everyone in the settlement knew to avoid. He had never struck her in public, never left marks where anyone could see. He had been careful that way, methodical. He would wait until his wife was asleep or away visiting her sister, and then he would come to the small shed behind the house where Ayla slept. He would stand in the doorway, blocking the light, and she would feel her body go cold and rigid, every muscle locking in place as if she could disappear by simply refusing to move. He never said much. He did not need to. The weight of his presence was enough. The knowledge that no one would believe her if she spoke, that she had nowhere else to go, that her survival depended on his tolerance. It had gone on for 5 years. 5 years of learning to leave her body, to let her mind drift somewhere far away while he did what he wanted. 5 years of scrubbing herself raw afterward, of biting down on rags to keep from making noise, of waking in the night with her heart pounding and her skin crawling. And then, one night, his wife had woken up. She had come to the shed and found him there, and instead of anger or sympathy, her face had filled with something far worse: disgust. Not at him, at Ayla. She had called her a whore, a seductress, a snake who had wormed her way into their home to destroy it. Gregor had said nothing, had simply stood there with his hands loose at his sides, and Ayla had understood in that moment that he would not defend her, that he had never intended to, that she had been nothing more than a thing to be used and discarded. She had run that same night. She had taken nothing with her, no food, no coin, no spare clothing. She had simply walked out into the darkness and kept walking until the settlement was far behind her, and her feet were bloody and her lungs burned from the cold. She did not know where she was going. She only knew that she could not stay. For weeks, she had drifted north, sleeping in barns and abandoned shacks, stealing bread from market stalls, avoiding anyone who looked at her too closely. By the time she reached Ravenhill, she was half-starved and delirious with exhaustion, and when Marta had found her collapsed in the alley behind the infirmary, it had felt less like rescue and more like a brief reprieve from an inevitable end. But she had survived. She always survived. It was the only thing she was good at. The morning the king arrived, Ayla was scrubbing blood from the floor. A miner had been brought in just after dawn, his leg mangled by a rock slide, and despite her best efforts to stop the bleeding, he had died within the hour. His body had been carried away by his clanmates, who had looked at her with flat, accusing eyes, as if his death had been her fault. Perhaps it had been. She was not a trained physician. She had learned everything she knew from watching Marta, from trial and error, from the few battered medical texts she had found in the infirmary's storage chest. She did what she could, but it was never enough. It was never enough. She was on her hands and knees, the scrub brush rough against her palms, when she heard the commotion outside. Voices raised in excitement, the clatter of hooves on cobblestone, the deep horn blast that signaled the arrival of someone important. She sat back on her heels, wiping her forehead with the back of her wrist, and frowned. Ravenhill was not the sort of place that received important visitors. It was too remote, too poor, too divided. The clans here spent more time fighting each other than worrying about politics, and the town council was made up of bitter old men who cared more about their own grievances than any larger concerns. Curiosity pulled her to the door. She stepped outside, squinting in the pale morning light, and saw a crowd gathering in the central square. The square was the heart of Ravenhill, a wide open space paved with uneven stones, surrounded by the town's few significant buildings. The council hall, the market hall, the chapel where the clans came together once a month to pretend they could coexist. In the center of the square stood a stone fountain that had not run in decades, its basin cracked and filled with frozen rainwater. Today, the square was packed with people, more than Ayla had ever seen in one place. Wolves from all the local clans stood shoulder to shoulder, their usual hostility temporarily set aside in favor of collective curiosity. Children darted between the adults, and vendors had abandoned their stalls to crane their necks for a better view. At the far end of the square, near the council hall, a group of riders had dismounted. Their horses were magnificent, tall and glossy and far too well fed to belong to anyone from Ravenhill. The riders themselves wore dark cloaks trimmed with silver, and even from a distance, Ayla could see the way they moved, the predatory grace that marked them as wolves of high rank. And at the center of the group stood a man who could only be the king, Aldrin Blackthorn. Even Ayla, who paid little attention to politics, knew the name. He was the supreme alpha, the one to whom all other alphas answered, the ruler of every werewolf clan in the kingdom. She had heard stories about him, whispered in the infirmary by patients who thought she was not listening. They said he was ruthless, that he had taken the throne at 22 after his father's assassination and had spent the years since consolidating power with an iron fist. They said he was cold, that he felt nothing, that he had executed his own uncle for treason without hesitation. They said he was cursed, that no mate had ever been found for him despite years of searching, and that the royal bloodline would die with him. Ayla did not know what to believe. She knew only that he was here, in Ravenhill, and that his presence meant trouble. Kings did not visit places like this unless they wanted something, and whatever it was, it would not be good for the people who lived here. She stayed near the edge of the crowd, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. She did not want to be here. She wanted to go back inside, to finish cleaning the floor, to lose herself in the numbing routine of work. But something kept her rooted in place. Some instinct she could not name. The king was speaking now, his voice carrying across the square. It was a deep voice, steady and commanding, the kind of voice that demanded attention without needing to shout. He was addressing the town council, something about negotiations, about alliances between the clans, about the need for unity in uncertain times. Ayla did not follow the details. She was too focused on the man himself. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair pulled back from a face that was all sharp lines and cold intensity. His eyes were pale, almost colorless, and even from this distance, they seemed to cut through everything they touched. He stood with the absolute stillness of someone who had never once doubted his own authority, and the wolves around him deferred to him without question. Ayla felt a strange tightness in her chest. She did not know why. She had no reason to care about this man or his politics. He was as far removed from her world as the stars. And then, everything happened at once. A shout from the rooftop, a flash of movement, the sharp, unmistakable whistle of an arrow cutting through the air. Ayla's body moved before her mind could catch up. She did not think. She did not hesitate. She simply ran, pushing through the crowd, her legs pumping, her heart slamming against her ribs. She did not know why she was running toward the danger instead of away from it. She did not know what she thought she could do. She only knew that if she did nothing, someone would die, and she had seen enough death already. She reached the king just as the arrow did. She threw herself forward, her shoulder colliding with his chest, and felt the impact shudder through her entire body. The arrow hit her instead, sinking deep into her side just below her ribs, and the pain was immediate and overwhelming, a white-hot explosion that stole her breath and turned her legs to water. She fell. The cobblestones rushed up to meet her, and she hit them hard, the side of her face scraping against the rough stone. She could hear shouting, could feel hands on her, but it all seemed very far away, as if she were sinking underwater. The pain was spreading now, radiating out from the wound in slow, pulsing waves, and with it came a coldness that started in her fingertips and crept steadily inward. Poison, she thought distantly. The arrow was poisoned. She tried to breathe, but her lungs would not cooperate. Her vision was narrowing, the edges going dark, and she could taste blood in her mouth. She thought she heard someone calling her name, but that did not make sense. No one here knew her name. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was a pair of pale eyes, wide with something that might have been shock, staring down at her as if she were the most incomprehensible thing in the world. And then there was nothing. When Aldrin Blackthorn looked down at the dying woman in his arms, he felt something he had not felt in years. Fear. Not for himself. He had long since accepted that death was a constant companion, that every day he lived was a day someone wanted him dead. But this woman, this stranger who had thrown herself in front of a poisoned arrow meant for him, was dying because of a choice she should never have had to make. Her blood was soaking through his cloak, hot and slick, and her pulse was already growing faint beneath his fingers. He did not know her. He had never seen her before in his life. She was human, fragile and breakable in a way that wolves were not, and there was no reason, no logical reason, for her to have done what she did. And yet she had. She had run toward death to save him, and now she was paying the price. His wolf stirred deep in his chest, a low, uneasy growl that he did not understand. It was not aggression. It was something else, something primal and instinctive, a recognition that made no sense. He pushed it aside. There was no time for confusion. If he did not act now, she would be dead within minutes. He looked up at his guards, at the chaos spreading through the square as wolves scrambled to secure the area and find the assassin. "Get Elias," he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Now." One of the guards hesitated. "Your Majesty, we need to—" "Now," Aldrin repeated, and the guard flinched and ran. Aldrin looked back down at the woman. Her eyes were closed, her face pale and bloodless, her breathing so shallow it was almost imperceptible. The arrow was still buried in her side, and he could see the dark stain spreading around it, could smell the acrid chemical scent of the poison. Nightsbane, most likely. A paralytic that shut down the nervous system within minutes. Lethal to humans. Even wolves struggled to survive it. He should let her go. It would be the logical thing to do. She was a stranger, a human, someone whose life had no bearing on his own, and yet his hands would not release her. His wolf would not let him. He made a decision that would change everything. He bent his head and bit down on his own wrist, hard enough to draw blood. The pain was sharp and immediate, but he ignored it. He pressed his bleeding wrist to her lips, forcing the wound against her mouth, and willed her to swallow. "Drink," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Drink, damn you." For a moment, nothing happened. Then her throat convulsed. A weak, reflexive swallow, and his blood slipped past her lips. Once, twice. He did not know if it would be enough. He did not know if it would do anything at all. But royal blood carried magic, ancient and powerful. And if there was even a chance it could keep her alive long enough for Elias to reach them, he would take it. He felt the moment the bond snapped into place. It was like a cord pulling taut between them, invisible but undeniable. And his wolf surged forward with a possessive snarl that nearly broke his control. Mate. The word echoed through his mind, primal and absolute, and he wanted to reject it, wanted to deny what his instincts were screaming at him, but he could not. The bond was there, real and unbreakable, and he had just claimed her without even knowing her name. Dr. Elias Ward arrived within minutes, breathless and disheveled, his medical bag clutched in one hand. He took one look at the scene and paled. "What happened?" "Arrow," Aldrin said tersely. "Poisoned. Nightsbane, I think." Elias swore and dropped to his knees beside them, already pulling supplies from his bag. "We need to get her somewhere stable. The infirmary—" "No," Aldrin said. "We take her to the keep." Elias looked up sharply. "Your Majesty, she's human. Even if we remove the arrow, even if we counteract the poison, the odds—" "I gave her my blood," Aldrin interrupted, and Elias froze. "You what?" "She's my mate," Aldrin said, and the words felt strange on his tongue, impossible and yet undeniable. "I claimed her." Elias stared at him. His expression caught somewhere between disbelief and horror. "You claimed a dying human woman you've never met." "Yes. Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Aldrin looked down at the woman in his arms, at her pale, still face, and felt the bond thrumming between them, fragile but real. "I know exactly what I've done," he said quietly. "Now save her life." Elias closed his eyes briefly, as if gathering his composure, and then nodded. "Help me stabilize her. We'll transport her to Blackthorn Keep as soon as she's able to move." He reached for the arrow, his hands steady, despite the tension in his shoulders. This is going to be delicate. If the arrowhead is barbed, removing it could cause more damage than leaving it in. Aldrin watched as Elias worked, his hands careful and precise, cutting away the fabric of the woman's dress to expose the wound. The arrow had gone deep, and the flesh around it was already darkening, the poison spreading through her system like ink in water. Elias applied a tourniquet above the wound, then produced a small vial from his bag. "Silverroot extract," he explained. "It won't neutralize the poison entirely, but it should slow the progression. Hold her steady." Aldrin tightened his grip, his arms forming a cradle around her, and felt the bond pulse again, stronger this time. His wolf was agitated, pacing and snarling in the back of his mind, furious that she was hurt, that she was suffering, that he could not simply will her back to health. It was irrational. He barely knew this woman, and yet every fiber of his being was screaming at him to protect her, to keep her safe, to never let her go. Elias poured the extract directly into the wound, and the woman's body jerked, a weak, involuntary spasm. Her eyes did not open, but a soft, pained sound escaped her lips, and Aldrin felt something twist in his chest. "Easy," he murmured, his voice gentler than he had intended. "You're safe. I have you." He did not know if she could hear him. He did not know if it mattered. But the words came anyway, instinctive and unbidden, and his wolf settled slightly, as if speaking to her was enough to calm the beast within him. Elias worked quickly, his movements efficient and practiced. He removed the arrow in one smooth motion, then packed the wound with treated cloth to slow the bleeding. "The poison is already in her bloodstream," he said grimly. "The extract will buy us time, but not much. If she's going to survive, she'll need intensive care. Days, maybe weeks. And even then, she'll survive," Aldrin said, and his voice held a certainty he did not entirely feel. "She has to." Elias glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "I hope you're right," he said quietly. "Because if she dies, that bond is going to tear you apart." Aldrin said nothing. He already knew. They carried her through the streets of Ravenhill on a stretcher improvised from cloaks and wooden poles, and the crowd parted before them like water before a ship's bow. Aldrin walked beside her, one hand resting on her shoulder, feeling the shallow rise and fall of her breathing beneath his palm. It was weak, too weak, but it was there. She was still alive. That was all that mattered. Blackthorn Keep rose from the mountainside like a fortress carved from the bones of the earth itself. It was a massive structure of dark stone and iron, its walls thick enough to withstand siege, its towers reaching toward the sky like accusing fingers. It had been built generations ago when the werewolf clans were still at war with each other, and it had been designed not for comfort, but for survival. The keep sprawled across 3 levels, its lower chambers dug deep into the rock, its upper halls crowned with battlements and arrow slits. A single road led up to it, winding back and forth along the cliff face, and at the gate stood guards in black armor, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. They opened the gate without question when they saw their king approaching, and Aldrin carried the woman through into the courtyard beyond. The keep's interior was warmer than the mountain air outside, heated by great fireplaces and enchanted braziers, but it still held a coldness that had nothing to do with temperature. This was a place built for war, and it showed in every stone, every narrow window, every shadowed corner. Servants moved through the halls like ghosts, keeping their heads down and their voices low, and the few guards they passed snapped to attention and then quickly looked away, as if they had seen something they were not meant to see. Elias led them to the medical wing, a series of rooms on the 2nd level that had been converted from what were once officers' quarters. The main room was spacious and well lit, with tall windows that overlooked the valley below and walls lined with cabinets filled with medical supplies. A large table dominated the center of the room, its surface scrubbed clean and covered with fresh linen, and it was here that they laid her down. Aldrin stepped back, allowing Elias room to work, but he did not leave. He stood at the edge of the table, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the woman's pale face. She looked even smaller here, even more fragile. and the sight of her lying so still made his wolf pace restlessly. He wanted to touch her, to reassure himself that she was real, that the bond between them was not some hallucination brought on by the chaos of the assassination attempt. But he forced himself to remain where he was. Elias needed space, and Aldrin's presence was already a distraction. Elias moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades treating battlefield wounds and poison victims. He cut away the rest of the woman's clothing, leaving her in only the thin chemise she wore beneath, and began a thorough examination of the wound. The flesh around the arrow's entry point was swollen and discolored, the veins beneath her skin standing out like dark threads. The poison was spreading, and even with the silver root extract slowing its progress, Elias's expression grew grimmer with each passing moment. "The arrow went deep," he said, more to himself than to Aldrin. "It missed the kidney, thank the gods, but it nicked the intestine. If infection sets in..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "I'll need to clean the wound thoroughly. This is going to take time." "How much time?" Aldrin asked. "Hours. Maybe longer." Elias glanced up at him, his eyes shadowed with concern. "Your Majesty, you should rest. You were nearly killed today. You need to..." "I'm staying," Aldrin said flatly. Elias sighed, but did not argue. He knew better than to try. Instead, he turned his attention back to his patient, his hands steady as he began the delicate work of cleaning and suturing the wound. He worked in silence, occasionally murmuring instructions to the young assistant who had appeared at some point, a wolf named Kara, who had been training under Elias for the past year. She moved with quiet competence, handing him tools and supplies without needing to be asked, and together they worked to save the life of a woman whose name none of them knew. It was Aldrin who finally broke the silence. "Her name," he said. "Someone must know her name." Elias paused, glancing at him. "I'll send someone to ask in the town. She's human, so she likely worked somewhere visible. The infirmary, perhaps, or one of the shops." Aldrin nodded, and one of the guards who had been standing by the door bowed and left to carry out the task. Aldrin returned his gaze to the woman, to the curve of her cheekbone, and the dark lashes that rested against her skin. She had a small scar on her jaw, barely visible, and another on her forearm. Old injuries, long healed. He wondered what her life had been, what had brought her to Ravenhill, what had possessed her to throw herself in front of an arrow meant for a stranger. The bond pulsed between them, a steady, insistent rhythm that he could not ignore. It was unlike anything he had ever felt before. He had heard stories of fated mates, of course, of the instant, undeniable connection that bound two wolves together for life. But he had never expected to experience it himself, and he had certainly never expected his mate to be human. Humans were fragile. They aged quickly. They could not shift, could not heal the way wolves did, could not survive the kind of life he led. And yet here she was, dying on his table because she had chosen to save him, and he could not bring himself to regret the bond even though it made no sense. His wolf disagreed. His wolf thought it made perfect sense. His wolf had recognized her the moment their eyes met, had claimed her the moment her blood touched his tongue, and now it growled possessively at the thought of anyone else touching her, even Elias. Aldrin pushed the instinct down. He was not a slave to his wolf. He had learned long ago to control the beast, to keep it leashed and obedient. But this was different. This was primal and overwhelming, and it took every ounce of his willpower to remain still and silent while Elias worked. Hours passed. The light from the windows shifted and faded, the sun sinking behind the mountains, and the room grew darker despite the lamps that Kara lit and placed around the table. Elias worked without pause, his hands moving with a precision that came from years of practice, and slowly, gradually, the woman's condition began to stabilize. Her breathing grew slightly stronger, the color returning to her lips, and the dark veins beneath her skin began to fade. It was not a recovery, not yet, but it was progress. It was hope. Finally, as the last of the stitches were tied off and the wound was bandaged, Elias stepped back and wiped his hands on a clean cloth. He looked exhausted, his face drawn and pale, but there was a faint glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. "She's stable," he said. "For now. The poison is still in her system, but the worst of it has been neutralized. If she can make it through the night, she has a chance. Aldrin felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he had not realized he was carrying. What does she need? Rest, fluids, monitoring. Elias hesitated. And luck. Humans don't usually survive Night's Bane, especially not in the quantities she was exposed to. The fact that she's still alive is... He trailed off, shaking his head. It's extraordinary. Your blood may have made the difference. Royal blood carries healing properties, especially when a bond is involved. But even so, this is unprecedented. Aldrin said nothing. He simply moved closer to the table, looking down at the woman who was now his mate in every way that mattered. She looked peaceful, her face relaxed in unconsciousness, and for the first time since the arrow had struck, he allowed himself to truly see her. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with a delicate bone structure and dark hair that fell in tangled waves around her shoulders. There was a fragility to her, yes, but also a strength. Something in the set of her jaw and the line of her shoulders that spoke of resilience, of survival against the odds. Move her to one of the guest chambers, Aldrin said. The one adjacent to my rooms. I want her watched at all times. If her condition changes, I want to know immediately. Elias nodded. I'll have Kara set up a rotation. Someone will be with her every hour. Good. Aldrin reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against the woman's hand where it lay limp on the table. Her skin was cool to the touch, but not cold, and he felt the bond hum in response. A quiet reassurance that she was still there, still fighting. And Elias? Your Majesty? Thank you. Elias blinked, clearly surprised by the gratitude, and then nodded. Of course, Your Majesty. It's my honor. They moved her carefully, lifting her onto a clean stretcher and carrying her through the halls to the guest chamber Aldrin had indicated. It was a comfortable room, larger than most, and furnished with a 4-poster bed, a writing desk, and a fireplace that was already crackling with warmth. The windows looked out over the valley, and on clear days, you could see all the way to Ravenhill below. Kara and one of the other assistants settled the woman into the bed, tucking blankets around her and adjusting the pillows beneath her head. Aldrin stood by the door, watching, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. When they were finished, Kara bowed and left, leaving Aldrin alone with the woman. He should have left as well. He had duties to attend to, reports to review, an investigation to oversee. Someone had tried to kill him today, and he needed to find out who and why. But his feet would not carry him away. His wolf would not let him leave her. So he pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on her face. "Who are you?" he murmured, the words barely audible in the quiet room. "And why did you save me?" She did not answer, of course. She lay silent and still, her chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm, and Aldrin found himself memorizing the details of her face, the shape of her nose, the curve of her lips, the way her eyelashes cast faint shadows on her cheeks. He had never spent this much time looking at anyone before. He had never felt the need to. But now, with the bond thrumming between them, he could not look away. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He turned, and one of his guards stepped inside, bowing low. "Your Majesty, we have information." Aldrin rose from the chair, his expression hardening. "Speak." "The woman's name is Ayla Morgan," the guard said. "She works at the infirmary in Ravenhill. Has been there for 2 years. Before that, no one knows. She keeps to herself, doesn't socialize, doesn't cause trouble. The healer who ran the infirmary before her, an old woman named Marta, took her in. Marta died 6 months ago, and the woman has been running the place alone ever since." Aldrin absorbed this information, his mind already working through the implications. Ayla. Her name was Ayla. It suited her somehow, soft but strong. What else? "The townsfolk don't trust her," the guard continued. "They think she's running from something. A few of them mentioned that she never talks about her past, and that she startles easily, like someone who's been hurt before." He hesitated. "One of the women at the market said she saw bruises on her once. Old ones. Said the woman looked like she'd been beaten." Aldrin's jaw tightened. his wolf snarling in the back of his mind. The thought of someone hurting her, of someone laying hands on her with violence, filled him with a cold, murderous rage. "Find out where she came from," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I want to know everything. Who she was before she came to Ravenhill, who might have hurt her, and whether they're still alive." "Yes, Your Majesty." The guard bowed again and left, closing the door softly behind him. Aldrin returned to the chair, his gaze settling once more on Ayla. He reached out, his fingers curling gently around her hand, and felt the bond pulse in response. "Ayla," he said softly, testing the name on his tongue. "Ayla Morgan. You're safe now. I promise you that. Whoever hurt you, wherever you came from, it doesn't matter. You're under my protection now, and no one will ever touch you again." It was a vow, spoken to a woman who could not hear him, and yet it felt binding, as real and unbreakable as the bond that tied them together. Aldrin did not make promises lightly. He had learned long ago that words were cheap, that action was what mattered. But this was different. This was a promise he intended to keep, no matter what it cost him. The night stretched on, long and silent. Aldrin remained by her side, watching over her as the hours crept past. Kara came in once to check on her patient, taking her pulse and adjusting the bandages, and Elias appeared shortly after midnight to administer another dose of the antidote. Both of them looked at Aldrin with poorly concealed curiosity, but neither said anything. They knew better than to question their king. By the time dawn began to break, casting pale light through the windows, Aldrin had not slept. He felt the exhaustion in his bones, the weight of the day pressing down on him, but he could not bring himself to leave. His wolf would not allow it. So he stayed, his hand wrapped around hers, his eyes fixed on her face, and waited for her to wake. She stirred just as the sun rose fully, a faint, almost imperceptible movement. Her eyelids fluttered, and a soft sound escaped her lips, something between a sigh and a moan. Aldrin leaned forward, his grip on her hand tightening. "Ayla," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes opened slowly, blinking against the light. They were dark, a deep brown that seemed to hold shadows, and for a moment, they were unfocused, confused. Then they found his face, and something changed. She stiffened, her breath catching, and he saw fear flash across her features, raw and instinctive. "Easy," he said, keeping his voice calm, soothing. "You're safe. You're in Blackthorn Keep. You were injured. Do you remember?" She stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly, and he could see her mind working, trying to piece together what had happened. Then, slowly, her gaze dropped to their joined hands, and her brow furrowed. "You," she said, her voice hoarse and barely audible. "The king." "Yes," Aldrin said. "I'm Aldrin Blackthorn, and you saved my life." She blinked, her confusion deepening. I don't understand. Why am I here? Why are you—" She tried to pull her hand away, but he held on gently, not restraining her, but not letting go either. "You were hit by a poisoned arrow," he said. "It was meant for me. You threw yourself in front of it." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You should have died. The poison was Nightsbane, lethal to humans. But you're alive." "I don't—" She trailed off, her eyes closing briefly as if she were in pain. "I don't remember. I remember the square, the crowd, and then—" She opened her eyes again, and this time, there was something sharper in her gaze, something wary. "Why am I still alive?" Aldrin hesitated. He did not know how to explain the bond, how to tell her that he had claimed her as his mate without her knowledge or consent, that her survival was tied to his blood and his magic. He did not know how she would react, but he could not lie to her. "I gave you my blood," he said simply. "It's the only reason you survived." She went very still. "Your blood," she repeated, her voice flat. "Yes. Why would you do that?" There was an edge to her tone now, something that might have been anger or disbelief or both. "You don't know me. I'm no one." "You saved my life," Aldrin said. "That makes you someone." She laughed, a short, bitter sound that made his wolf bristle. "I'm a human. A nobody from a nowhere town. Why would a king care if I lived or died? Aldrin met her gaze, his expression steady. Because you mattered enough to save me, he said. And because you're my mate. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and irrevocable. Ayla stared at him, her face going pale, and he saw the moment the reality of what he had said hit her. No, she said, her voice shaking. That's not possible. I'm human. I know. Humans can't be mates to wolves. Everyone knows that. And yet here we are. She pulled her hand free this time, her movements jerky and panicked, and pressed herself back against the pillows as if she could disappear into them. This isn't real. This is some kind of mistake. You need to take it back. I can't, Aldrin said, and his voice was gentler than he had intended. The bond is formed. It's done. Then break it, she said desperately. There has to be a way. You can't just claim someone without asking. That's not how this works. I know, Aldrin said again, and he felt a pang of guilt, sharp and uncomfortable. She was right. He had taken her choice away, had bound her to him without her consent, and no matter how instinctive it had been, no matter how necessary it had seemed in the moment, it was still a violation. I'm sorry, he said, and he meant it. I didn't plan this. I didn't expect it. But it happened, and now we have to deal with it. Ayla shook her head, her hands clenched into fists in the blankets. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for any of this. I just wanted to... She stopped, her voice breaking, and he saw tears welling in her eyes. I just wanted to be left alone. Aldrin felt something twist in his chest. He had seen fear before, had seen desperation and anger and grief. But this was different. This was defeat, the kind that came from a life spent being hurt and controlled and never having a choice. And he had just added to that burden. I won't force you to stay, he said quietly. If you want to leave, once you're healed, I won't stop you. But until then, you're under my protection. No one will hurt you here. I give you my word. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to determine whether he was telling the truth. Your word doesn't mean anything to me, she said finally. I don't know you. Then get to know me, Aldrin said. You have time, and when you're ready to decide, I'll listen. She said nothing, just turned her face away, and he knew the conversation was over. He rose from the chair, his movements slow and deliberate, and walked to the door. Before he left, he glanced back at her one last time. Rest, he said. You're safe here. I promise. And then he was gone, leaving her alone with her fear and her confusion and the bond that neither of them had asked for, but could not escape. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of pain and uneasy rest. Ayla drifted in and out of consciousness, her body fighting the remnants of the poison while her mind struggled to process what had happened. She was alive, though she did not entirely understand how or why. The arrow should have killed her. The poison should have stopped her heart within minutes. And yet here she was, lying in a bed softer than anything she had ever known, in a room warmer and cleaner than any place she had ever lived. And the only explanation was that a king had given her his blood and claimed her as his mate. It did not feel real. None of it felt real. She spent most of her time alone. Aldrin did not return after that first conversation, though she could feel his presence in the keep, a constant awareness at the edges of her consciousness that she could not explain and did not want. The bond, she assumed. It was like a thread connecting them, invisible but tangible, and it made her skin crawl. She had spent years trying to escape the control of others, trying to carve out a small space in the world where she could exist on her own terms. And now she was tied to someone she did not know, someone who had taken that choice from her without asking. Kara, the young assistant who worked under Dr. Ward, came in regularly to check on her. She was quiet and efficient, her movements gentle as she changed bandages and administered medicine, and she never asked questions that Ayla did not want to answer. Ayla appreciated that. She did not want to talk. She did not want to explain herself or her feelings, or the growing panic that clawed at her chest every time she thought too hard about her situation. Dr. Ward himself visited twice a day, morning and evening. his examinations thorough and his manner professional. He was an older man, perhaps in his mid-30s, with kind eyes and a calm demeanor that reminded her a little of Marta. He did not treat her like a curiosity or an inconvenience, which was more than she could say for some of the other wolves she had glimpsed through the door. She had seen the way they looked at her when they passed in the hallway, their expressions ranging from confusion to distaste. A human in Blackthorn Keep, a human bonded to their king. It was unheard of, and she could feel their judgment like a weight pressing down on her. "Your recovery is progressing well," Elias said on the 4th day, as he unwrapped the bandages around her torso to inspect the wound. "The infection we were worried about hasn't set in, and the tissue is healing cleanly. You're stronger than you look." Ayla said nothing. She kept her eyes fixed on the ceiling, on the dark wooden beams that crossed it, and tried not to think about the pain that flared every time she moved. Elias glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "You should be dead," he said bluntly. "The amount of Nightsbane in your system should have killed you 3 times over. The fact that you're sitting here talking to me is nothing short of a miracle." "I'm not talking," Ayla said, her voice flat. Elias smiled faintly. Fair point. He finished rebandaging the wound and stepped back, wiping his hands on a clean cloth. "Still, you're lucky, or perhaps something more than lucky." "Lucky," Ayla repeated, and there was a bitter edge to her tone. "Is that what you call this?" Elias hesitated, his smile fading. "I know this isn't easy for you," he said carefully. "Being here, being bonded to someone you don't know. But His Majesty is a good man. He won't hurt you." "He already did," Ayla said quietly. "He took my choice." Elias opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're right," he said finally. "He did, and I can't justify that. But I can tell you that he's struggling with it too. He didn't expect this any more than you did. That doesn't make it better." "No," Elias agreed. "It doesn't. But maybe in time, you'll find a way to make peace with it. Or not. That's your decision to make." He picked up his medical bag and moved toward the door. "For what it's worth, I think he cares about you. More than he's willing to admit, even to himself." Ayla did not respond, and after a moment, Elias left, closing the door softly behind him. She lay there in the silence, staring at the ceiling, and felt the bond pulse faintly in her chest. She did not want to think about whether Aldrin cared about her or not. She did not want to think about him at all, but the bond made that impossible. She could feel him always, a distant presence that tugged at her awareness no matter how hard she tried to ignore it. It was invasive and uncomfortable, and it made her want to scream. By the end of the first week, she was strong enough to sit up without feeling dizzy, and by the end of the second, she could walk slowly around the room, leaning on the furniture for support. Her body was healing faster than it should have, faster than any human's body had a right to, and she knew it was because of the bond, because of Aldrin's blood in her veins. It made her feel like she was no longer entirely herself, like something foreign had been grafted onto her, and she hated it. She also hated the fact that she had nothing to do. The room, as comfortable as it was, felt like a cage. She had spent her entire adult life working, moving, surviving, and now she was confined to a single space with nothing to occupy her hands or her mind. She asked Kara for books, and the girl brought her a small stack from the Keep's library. But Ayla found it hard to concentrate. Her thoughts kept drifting, spiraling into dark places she did not want to go. She thought about Gregor. She thought about the shed behind his house, about the way he had stood in the doorway with the light behind him, casting his face into shadow. She thought about his wife's voice, sharp and accusing, and the way the people of the settlement had looked at her afterward, as if she were something dirty and shameful. She thought about running, about the weeks she had spent on the road with no destination and no plan, driven only by the desperate need to escape. And she thought about the arrow, about the moment she had seen it arcing through the air, about the way her body had moved without thought, about the impact and the pain and the certainty that she was going to die. She did not know why she had done it. She did not know why she had cared whether a king lived or died. But in that moment, Something in her had refused to let another person die when she could prevent it, even if it cost her everything. Maybe that made her stupid. Maybe it made her reckless. Or maybe it just meant that after years of being hurt and broken and treated as less than human, she still had enough of herself left to care. She was sitting by the window, watching the snow fall over the valley below, when the door opened and Aldrin stepped inside. She stiffened, her hands tightening on the armrests of the chair, and turned her head to look at him. He stood in the doorway, tall and imposing in the dark clothing he always wore, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I should have knocked." "It's your keep," Ayla said. "You don't need permission to go anywhere." "Maybe not," Aldrin said. "But you're entitled to privacy. I'll remember that next time." He moved further into the room, but he kept his distance, as if he were afraid of spooking her. Ayla watched him warily, her body tense and ready to flee, even though she knew she would not get far. The bond hummed between them, stronger now that he was close, and she felt her pulse quicken in response. "How are you feeling?" Aldrin asked. "Fine," Ayla said shortly. "Elias says you're healing well." "So I've been told." Aldrin nodded slowly, his pale eyes studying her face. "You don't have to lie to me," he said. "If you're in pain, or if you need something, you can tell me." "I don't need anything from you," Ayla said, and her voice was colder than she had intended. "Except to be left alone." Aldrin flinched, just slightly, and she felt a pang of something that might have been guilt. But she pushed it down. She did not owe him anything. She did not owe him kindness or understanding or forgiveness. He had done this to her. He had bound her to him without asking, and now he had to live with the consequences. "I know you're angry," Aldrin said quietly. "You have every right to be, but I need you to understand something. The assassination attempt wasn't random. Someone wanted me dead, and they're not going to stop just because they failed once. As long as you're bonded to me, you're in danger too." Ayla laughed, a short, humorless sound. "So now I'm supposed to care about your political problems? I didn't ask to be part of this. I didn't ask to be your mate. You made that decision for me." "I know," Aldrin said, and there was a heaviness in his voice that gave her pause. "And I'm sorry for that. But it's done, and we can't undo it. So we have to find a way to move forward." "Forward," Ayla repeated. "What does that even mean?" "It means we figure out how to coexist," Aldrin said. "You don't have to like me. You don't have to trust me. But we're connected now, whether we want to be or not. And that means we're going to have to deal with each other. I'm not asking you to stay here forever. I'm just asking you to stay until the threat is neutralized, until I know you'll be safe." "Safe," Ayla said bitterly. "I've never been safe. Not once in my entire life. Why would I start now?" Aldrin's jaw tightened, and she saw something flash in his eyes, something that might have been anger or frustration or pain. "Because you deserve to be," he said. "And because I will do everything in my power to make sure no one ever hurts you again." Ayla stared at him, her chest tight. She wanted to believe him. Some small, desperate part of her wanted to believe that someone actually cared about what happened to her, that she was worth protecting. But belief was dangerous. Belief led to disappointment, to heartbreak, to pain. She had learned that lesson too many times to forget it now. "I don't believe you," she said finally. Aldrin nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. "Then I'll just have to prove it," he said. "However long it takes." He turned and walked to the door, his movements slow and deliberate, and paused with his hand on the handle. "For what it's worth," he said without looking back. "I'm glad you're alive, even if you hate me for it." And then he was gone, leaving her alone with the bond and the snow and the ache in her chest that she could not name. The investigation into the assassination attempt moved slowly, hampered by the web of secrets and loyalties that bound the werewolf clans together. Aldrin threw himself into it with the single-minded focus that had defined his reign, working late into the night, interviewing witnesses, reviewing reports, and following every lead no matter how tenuous. The assassin had been killed in the chaos following the attack, shot down by one of Aldrin's guards before he could escape, but that had only raised more questions. Who had hired him? Who had supplied the Nightsbane-tipped arrow? And most importantly, who stood to gain from Aldrin's death? The list of suspects was long. The werewolf clans had been united under the Blackthorn throne for 3 generations, but unity was a fragile thing, maintained through a combination of fear, respect, and carefully balanced alliances. There were always those who chafed under the king's rule, who saw the centralized power as a threat to their own autonomy. And there were those who had personal grudges, old wounds that had never fully healed, debts unpaid, and insults unforgiven. Aldrin knew he had enemies. He had made them deliberately, ruthlessly. In the years since he had taken the throne, he had executed traitors, stripped titles from those who had overstepped, and crushed rebellions before they could gain momentum. It was necessary. It was survival. But it also meant that there were dozens of people who would celebrate his death, and any one of them could have been behind the attack. The breakthrough came 2 weeks after the assassination attempt, when one of Aldrin's spies returned from the Eastern Territories with troubling news. There had been movements in the borderlands, quiet gatherings of wolves who should not have been meeting, supplies being moved under cover of darkness. And at the center of it all was a name that Aldrin had not heard in years: Dorian Valtor. Dorian had been a general once, one of Aldrin's most trusted commanders, a man who had fought at his side during the border wars and had earned his place through blood and loyalty. But that loyalty had shattered when Aldrin had refused to support Dorian's proposal to expand the kingdom's territory through aggressive conquest. Dorian had seen it as weakness, as a betrayal of the warrior spirit that defined the wolves, and he had spoken out publicly, calling Aldrin a coward and a fool. Aldrin had given him a choice: renounce his words and accept punishment, or leave the kingdom and never return. Dorian had chosen exile, and now, it seemed, he was back. Aldrin stood in his study, the spy's report spread out on the desk before him, and felt a cold anger settle in his chest. Dorian was not just back. He was building an army. He was gathering disaffected wolves, those who felt the kingdom had grown soft, and he was promising them a return to the old ways, to strength and conquest and glory. And if the reports were accurate, he was also experimenting with ways to weaponize humans against the clans, using them as pawns in a larger game. The arrow that had been meant for Aldrin had been fired by a human. The poison had been designed to kill quickly, to prevent any chance of survival. And if Dorian had been behind it, then the attack was not just about removing Aldrin from the throne. It was about destabilizing the kingdom, about proving that the king was vulnerable, that the clans could be defeated. And Ayla had walked right into the middle of it. Aldrin closed his eyes, his hands bracing on the desk, and felt the bond pulse in his chest. She was safe, for now, but that safety was an illusion. As long as Dorian was out there, as long as he saw Ayla as a tool to be used or a weakness to be exploited, she was in danger. And the bond made her an even more tempting target. If Dorian could capture her, he could use her to control Aldrin, to force him into impossible choices. Or worse, he could use her in whatever twisted experiments he was conducting, turning her into a weapon against the very person she was bonded to. Aldrin would not let that happen. He could not. He called a meeting of his inner circle that evening, gathering his most trusted advisors in the war room on the keep's 3rd level. It was a stark space, dominated by a large table covered with maps and tactical documents, and the wolves who assembled around it were all seasoned warriors, men and women who had fought beside Aldrin for years. Elias was there as well, his presence a reminder that not all battles were fought with swords. Aldrin laid out what they knew, his voice steady and controlled as he explained Dorian's return and the growing threat he represented. The room grew tense as he spoke, and by the time he finished, several of the wolves were growling low in their throats, their eyes glowing faintly with suppressed anger. "We need to act quickly," said Commander Theron, a grizzled veteran with scars across his face and hands. "If Dorian is gathering forces, we can't afford to wait until he's strong enough to challenge us directly. We should strike now, before he's ready." "We don't know where he is," Aldrin said. "The reports place him in the eastern borderlands, but that's a vast area. If we send troops in without a clear target, we'll be wasting resources and time." "Then we send scouts," said Lady Marina. one of Aldrin's most cunning strategists. Small teams, fast and discreet. They find Dorian's location, and then we move in force. Aldrin nodded. Agreed. Theron, organize the scouting parties. I want them deployed within the week, and I want regular reports. If anything changes, I need to know immediately. What about the woman? Morena asked, and the room went silent. All eyes turned to Aldrin, and he felt the weight of their curiosity and judgment. The human, your mate. Dorian will have heard about her by now. If he knows she's bonded to you, he'll see her as an opportunity. She's under my protection, Aldrin said, his voice hard. No one touches her. Of course, Your Majesty, Morena said smoothly, but protection only goes so far. If Dorian sends assassins, or if he tries to take her by force, we need to be prepared. She's a vulnerability, whether you want to admit it or not. Aldrin's wolf snarled, and he fought to keep it under control. She's not a vulnerability, he said, his voice low and dangerous. She's my mate, and anyone who thinks they can use her to get to me will learn exactly what that means. The room fell silent again, and Aldrin saw the understanding dawn in their eyes. He was not just protecting Ayla out of duty or obligation. He was protecting her because the bond had made her his, and he would burn the world to the ground before he let anyone harm her. Increase security around the keep, he said, his tone brooking no argument. Double the guards on her door. No one goes in or out without my approval. And if anyone even looks at her wrong, I want to know about it. Yes, Your Majesty, Theron said, and the others murmured their agreement. The meeting continued for another hour as they discussed strategies and contingencies, but Aldrin's mind kept drifting back to Ayla. She was alone in her room right now, recovering from wounds that should have killed her, and she had no idea how much danger she was still in. He wanted to tell her, to warn her, but he also did not want to frighten her more than she already was. She had made it clear that she did not trust him, that she did not want his help, and he did not know how to bridge that gap. But he would find a way. He had to. When the meeting finally ended and the others had filed out, Elias remained, lingering by the door. Aldrin looked up, raising an eyebrow. Something on your mind? She's terrified, Elias said bluntly. Of you, of this place, of the bond. I've been treating her for 2 weeks and I can see it in her eyes. She's holding herself together by sheer force of will, but she's one wrong word away from breaking. Aldrin's jaw tightened. I know. Do you? Elias stepped closer, his expression serious. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're treating this as a tactical problem. Secure the asset, neutralize the threat, move forward. But she's not an asset, Aldrin. She's a person who's been hurt, badly, and who needs more than protection. She needs understanding. She needs to feel like she has some control over her own life. I'm trying, Aldrin said, and there was a weariness in his voice that he rarely allowed anyone to hear. I don't know what else to do. Every time I try to talk to her, I make it worse. Then stop trying to fix it, Elias said. Stop trying to make her see things your way. Just be there. Let her set the pace. Let her decide when she's ready to talk, when she's ready to trust. It's the only way this is going to work. Aldrin nodded slowly, absorbing the advice. Elias was right. He had been approaching this the way he approached everything else, with strategy and control, and it was not working. Ayla did not need a king. She needed someone who would listen, who would give her space, who would let her find her own way. Thank you, he said quietly. Elias smiled faintly. Don't thank me yet. You've got a long road ahead of you. He clapped Aldrin on the shoulder and left, leaving him alone in the war room with his thoughts and the distant, persistent hum of the bond. Aldrin stood there for a long time, staring at the map spread out on the table, and thought about the woman who had saved his life without knowing him, without expecting anything in return. She had thrown herself in front of an arrow because it was the right thing to do, and now she was paying the price for that choice. He would make it right. Somehow, he would make it right. 3 weeks after the arrow, Ayla was finally allowed to leave her room. Elias had cleared her for limited movement, though he had warned her not to overexert herself, and Kara had helped her dress in clothing that actually fit, simple garments in muted colors that were far finer than anything she had ever owned. Ayla had protested at first, uncomfortable with accepting anything from Aldrin, but Kara had pointed out gently that her old dress had been cut to pieces during the surgery, and there was nothing else available. So Ayla had relented, pulling on the soft woolen dress and the lined boots, and had stood before the mirror feeling like an imposter. She did not recognize the woman staring back at her. She looked healthier than she had in years, her face no longer gaunt, her skin no longer sallow. The wound in her side was still tender, but it no longer dominated her every movement, and she could stand upright without feeling like she was going to collapse. She should have been grateful. She should have been relieved. Instead, she felt trapped, like she was wearing someone else's skin, living someone else's life. Kara offered to give her a tour of the keep, and Ayla accepted, desperate for something to do, some way to occupy her mind. They walked slowly through the corridors, Kara pointing out various rooms and explaining their functions. The keep was larger than Ayla had realized, a sprawling maze of halls and chambers that had been built and rebuilt over generations. There were entire wings that were closed off, their doors locked and their windows shuttered, and Kara explained that many of them had not been used since the war ended. The keep had been designed to house an army, but now it felt empty, echoing and cold despite the fires that burned in every hearth. They passed guards at regular intervals, wolves in dark armor who stood at attention and watched Ayla with expressions that ranged from curiosity to suspicion. She kept her eyes down, her shoulders hunched, and tried to make herself as small as possible. She did not belong here. Everyone knew it. She was a human in a world built for wolves, a fragile, temporary presence in a place meant to withstand centuries. Kara led her to the library, a vast room on the second level with walls lined floor to ceiling with books. Tall windows let in pale sunlight, and there were reading nooks scattered throughout, furnished with chairs and small tables. It was quiet here, peaceful, and Ayla felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease. Books she understood. Books were safe. "You're welcome to come here whenever you like," Kara said. "His Majesty said you should have access to the entire keep, except for the restricted areas. The library is open to everyone." Ayla nodded, running her fingers along the spines of the nearest shelf. The titles were in various languages, some of which she recognized, and others she did not. There were histories and philosophies, medical texts and military treatises, and an entire section devoted to what looked like folklore and mythology. She pulled out a book at random, flipping through the pages, and felt a small spark of interest. This, at least, was something she could do. Something that did not involve thinking about the bond, or the king, or the impossible situation she found herself in. "Thank you," she said quietly, and Kara smiled. "Of course. If you need anything, just ask one of the servants. They'll help you." Ayla nodded again, and Kara left, her footsteps fading down the corridor. Ayla stood there for a moment, alone in the vast room, and then carried the book to one of the reading nooks and settled into the chair. She opened the book to the first page and began to read, losing herself in the words, in the comfort of stories that were not her own. She did not know how long she sat there. Time seemed to slip away, the sunlight shifting across the floor, the shadows lengthening. She read about ancient clans and forgotten wars, about kings and queens who had ruled with wisdom or cruelty or some combination of the two. She read about the bond between mates, about the way it was supposed to feel, the way it was supposed to bring two souls together in perfect harmony. The descriptions made her chest ache. Her bond did not feel like harmony. It felt like a chain. She was so absorbed in the book that she did not hear the footsteps approaching until a shadow fell across the page. She looked up, startled, and found Aldrin standing a few feet away, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to disturb you." Ayla closed the book, her heart beating faster. "It's fine," she said, though it was not fine, not really. She had been avoiding him for weeks, and now here he was, and she did not know what to say or how to act. "Kara said you were exploring the keep," Aldrin said. "How are you finding it?" "It's large," Ayla said, for lack of anything better, And cold. Yes, Aldrin agreed. It's not the most welcoming place. It was built for war, not comfort. He hesitated, then gestured to the chair across from her. May I sit? Ayla wanted to say no. She wanted to tell him to leave, to give her space, to stop appearing in her life like a shadow she could not escape. But something in his expression stopped her. He looked tired, she realized. There were lines around his eyes that she had not noticed before, and a heaviness in his posture that spoke of sleepless nights and burdens too great to share. It's your library, she said finally. That's not what I asked. Ayla sighed. Yes, you can sit. Aldrin lowered himself into the chair, his movements careful, as if he were afraid of spooking her. They sat in silence for a moment, the air between them thick with unspoken words. Ayla kept her eyes on the book in her lap, her fingers tracing the embossed title on the cover. I wanted to talk to you, Aldrin said finally. About what's happening. About Dorian. Ayla looked up, frowning. Who? Dorian Valtor, Aldrin said. The man who ordered the assassination attempt. He's a former general, someone I exiled years ago. He's back now, and he's building an army. And he knows about you. Ayla felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean he knows about me? The bond, Aldrin said. It's not a secret. My guards saw what happened, saw me give you my blood. Word has spread. And Dorian is not the kind of man to overlook an opportunity. If he can get to you, he can use you against me. Ayla's hands tightened on the book. So I'm bait, she said flatly. That's what you're saying. I'm a tool he can use to hurt you. You're not a tool, Aldrin said, his voice sharp. You're a person, but yes, he will see you as leverage, which is why I need you to stay here, in the keep, where I can protect you. Protect me, Ayla repeated, and there was a bitter edge to her tone. Like you protected me when you forced this bond on me? Aldrin flinched, and she saw pain flash across his face. I know you're angry, he said quietly. I know you didn't choose this, but the bond is real, Ayla. And whether you like it or not, we're connected now. If Dorian hurts you, it will hurt me. And if he kills you... He trailed off, his jaw tightening. I can't let that happen. Why? Ayla demanded. Why do you care? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Because you saved my life, Aldrin said. And his voice was raw, unguarded in a way she had not heard before. Because you threw yourself in front of an arrow meant for me, and you didn't have to. You could have stayed in the crowd. You could have let me die, but you didn't. And that means something. Ayla stared at him, her chest tight. She did not know what to say. She did not know how to process the vulnerability in his voice, the way he was looking at her like she was something precious, something worth protecting. It terrified her. She had spent so long being invisible, being worthless, that the idea of mattering to someone felt dangerous, like standing on the edge of a cliff and waiting for the ground to give way. I didn't do it for you, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't even know who you were. I couldn't let someone die. Not if I could stop it. I know, Aldrin said. And that's exactly why you matter. Ayla looked away, blinking back the sting of tears. She would not cry in front of him. She would not give him that. What do you want from me? She asked. What am I supposed to do? Just sit here and wait for someone to come kill me? Live my life knowing that every breath I take puts a target on your back? I want you to trust me, Aldrin said. I know I don't deserve it. I know I took your choice away, and I can't undo that. But I'm asking you to give me a chance to prove that I'm not like whoever hurt you before. That I'm not going to use you or control you or throw you away when you're no longer convenient. Ayla laughed, a harsh, broken sound. You don't know anything about me, she said. You don't know what I've been through or why I ran or what I've survived. You just see a bond and think that makes us connected. But it doesn't. Not really. Then tell me, Aldrin said, leaning forward slightly. Tell me what you've been through. Help me understand. Ayla shook her head, her hands trembling. No, she said. I don't owe you my story. I don't owe you anything. You're right, Aldrin said. You don't. But I'm offering to listen, if you ever want to talk. Not as your king, Not as your mate, just as someone who wants to know you. Ayla met his gaze, searching his face for any sign of deception, any hint that this was a trick or a manipulation. But all she saw was sincerity, a quiet earnestness that made her walls crack just slightly. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him. But belief was a luxury she could not afford. "I need time," she said finally. I can't just trust you because you want me to. That's not how it works." "I know," Aldrin said. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." He stood then, his movements slow and deliberate, and Ayla watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest. When the door closed behind him, she let out a shaky breath and pressed her hands to her face. She did not know what to feel. Anger, fear, confusion, all of it tangled together into a knot she could not unravel. And beneath it all, faint but undeniable, was the bond, humming softly in her chest. A reminder that no matter how hard she tried to push him away, she could not escape him. She hated it. And yet, some small, treacherous part of her wondered what it would be like to stop fighting, to let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she could be safe. The days that followed settled into a tentative rhythm. Ayla spent her mornings in the library, reading and trying to occupy her mind, and her afternoons walking the corridors of the keep, growing stronger with each passing day. She saw Aldrin occasionally, brief encounters in hallways or the dining hall, and each time he greeted her politely and then left her alone. He did not push, he did not demand. He simply existed at the edges of her life, a constant presence that she could not ignore but also could not entirely resent. Elias continued to check on her regularly, his examinations thorough and his manner kind. He never asked about the bond or about her feelings for Aldrin, and she appreciated that more than she could say. He treated her like a patient, not a curiosity, and that small bit of normalcy was a lifeline in a world that had become increasingly strange. One evening, as she was returning to her room after dinner, she heard voices coming from one of the side corridors. She paused, instinctively cautious, and recognized Aldrin's voice, low and tense. Curiosity got the better of her, and she moved closer, staying in the shadows. "We've located Dorian's base," Theron was saying. "It's in the eastern mountains, fortified and well guarded. He's got at least 200 wolves with him, maybe more. And he's been stockpiling weapons. This isn't just a rebellion, Your Majesty. He's planning a war. Then we end it before it starts," Aldrin said, his voice hard. "Gather the troops. We move within the week." "What about the human?" Marina's voice, sharp and calculating. "If we leave the keep, she'll be vulnerable. Dorian could send assassins." "I'm doubling the guard," Aldrin said. "No one gets in or out without my approval. She'll be safe." "Safe in a cage," Marina said dryly. "I'm sure she'll love that." "I don't care if she loves it," Aldrin snapped. "I care that she's alive. We do this my way, Marina. Understood?" There was a pause, and then Marina said, "Of course, Your Majesty." Ayla stepped back, her heart pounding. Aldrin was leaving. He was going to war, and she was going to be left here, locked in the keep like a prisoner. The thought filled her with a complicated mix of relief and fear. Relief because his absence would give her space, would let her breathe without the constant weight of the bond pressing down on her. Fear, because if something happened to him, if Dorian killed him, she did not know what would happen to her. Would the bond break? Would it kill her? She did not know, and the uncertainty was terrifying. She returned to her room, her mind racing. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and thought about everything that had happened, everything that was still to come. She thought about Aldrin's words in the library, about his offer to listen, to understand. She thought about the way he had looked at her, like she mattered, like she was worth something. And she thought about the bond, the invisible thread that tied them together, and wondered if it was possible to hate something and need it at the same time. The next morning, she woke early and dressed quickly. She did not know what she was going to do, only that she could not sit here and do nothing. She left her room and made her way through the corridors, her steps purposeful, and found herself standing outside the door to Aldrin's study. She hesitated, her hand raised to knock, and then forced herself to do it before she could lose her nerve. "Come in," Aldrin's voice called from inside. Ayla opened the door and stepped into the room. Aldrin was seated at his desk, surrounded by maps and documents, and he looked up in surprise when he saw her. "Ayla," he said, rising to his feet. "Is everything all right?" "No," Ayla said, closing the door behind her. "Everything is not all right. You're leaving. You're going to fight Dorian, and you're leaving me here." Aldrin's expression softened. "I have to," he said. "Dorian is a threat to the entire kingdom. If I don't stop him now, more people will die." "I know that," Ayla said, her voice shaking. "I'm not asking you to stay. I'm asking you to take me with you." Aldrin stared at her, and for a moment, he looked genuinely shocked. "Absolutely not," he said. "It's too dangerous. You're still recovering, and if Dorian gets his hands on you, he's going to come after me anyway," Ayla interrupted. "You said it yourself. I'm leverage. If you leave me here, I'm just a sitting target. At least if I'm with you, I'll know what's happening. I won't be locked in a room waiting for someone to kill me." "You'll be protected," Aldrin said. "The keep is the safest place for you." "Safe," Ayla repeated, and there was a bitter laugh in her voice. "I've never been safe, Aldrin. Not once in my entire life. And I'm tired of waiting for other people to decide what happens to me. I want a choice. I want to have some say in my own fate." Aldrin looked at her for a long moment. His expression conflicted. She could see the war happening behind his eyes. The instinct to protect her warring with the understanding that she was right, that keeping her locked away was just another way of taking her choice. Finally, he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "If you come with us," he said slowly, "you stay with the medical unit. You don't go anywhere near the fighting. You listen to Elias, and you follow his orders. And if things go wrong, if Dorian's forces break through, you run. You don't try to be a hero. You just run. Do you understand?" Ayla nodded, her chest tight with a complicated mix of relief and fear. "I understand. I mean it, Ayla," Aldrin said, his voice firm. "I can't lose you, not after everything." Ayla met his gaze, and for the first time she let herself truly see him. Not as the king who had taken her choice, not as the stranger who had bound her to him without asking, but as a man who was trying, in his own flawed way, to do the right thing. A man who was terrified of losing her, even though she had given him no reason to care. "I'll be careful," she said quietly. "I promise." Aldrin nodded, and something in his expression eased. "Then we leave in 3 days," he said. "Elias will make sure you're equipped with everything you need. And Ayla?" "Yes?" "Thank you," he said, "for trusting me enough to ask." Ayla did not know what to say to that, so she simply nodded and left, closing the door softly behind her. As she walked back to her room, she felt the bond pulse in her chest, stronger than it had been before, and realized that she had just taken the first step towards something she had been avoiding for weeks. She had just chosen to trust him, and that terrified her more than anything. The 3 days passed quickly, filled with preparations and last-minute adjustments. Ayla spent most of her time with Elias, who outfitted her with practical clothing designed for travel and explained what her role would be. She would stay with the medical unit at the rear of the column, helping to treat wounded soldiers and ensuring that supplies were organized and accessible. It was work she knew, work she was good at, and the familiarity of it helped calm some of her anxiety. Aldrin was busy with his own preparations, coordinating with his commanders and finalizing the battle strategy. Ayla saw him only in passing, brief glimpses in the corridors or across the courtyard, but each time she felt the bond hum between them, a quiet acknowledgement that they were connected, that they were in this together. On the morning of their departure, Ayla stood in the courtyard, dressed in sturdy boots and a thick cloak, and watched as the troops assembled. There were hundreds of them, wolves in dark armor, their faces grim and determined. Horses stamped and snorted, their breath misting in the cold air, and supply wagons were loaded with weapons and provisions. It was an army, and Ayla felt very small standing among them. Elias appeared at her side, carrying a medical bag. "Ready?" he asked. No, Ayla said honestly, but I don't think I'll ever be. Elias smiled faintly. That's probably the sanest thing anyone said all morning. He handed her the bag. You'll be riding with me. Stay close, and if anything happens, you follow my lead. Understood? Ayla nodded, slinging the bag over her shoulder. She looked across the courtyard and saw Aldrin standing near the front of the column, speaking with Theron and Morena. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, and their eyes met. He did not smile, but something in his expression softened, and he gave her a small nod. A promise, maybe. Or a reassurance. Ayla nodded back, and then the horn sounded, a deep, resonant note that echoed off the mountains, and the army began to move. She climbed into the wagon beside Elias, her heart pounding, and as the keep disappeared behind them, she realized that there was no turning back now. She was going to war, and whatever happened next, she would face it not as a victim, but as someone who had chosen her own path, even if that path led straight into the jaws of death. The journey to the eastern mountains took 6 days. They traveled through terrain that grew increasingly hostile with each mile, leaving the relatively sheltered valleys behind and climbing into high passes where the wind cut like knives and the snow never fully melted. The column moved steadily, a long line of wolves and horses and supply wagons, and at night they made camp in whatever shelter they could find, huddling around fires that struggled to stay lit in the thin mountain air. Ayla rode with Elias in the medical wagon, surrounded by supplies and the 2 other healers who had been assigned to their unit. They were both wolves, a middle-aged woman named Kendra and a young man named Oren, and they treated Ayla with polite wariness, clearly unsure what to make of a human traveling with the king's army. Ayla did not try to force conversation. She kept her head down and focused on her work, organizing bandages and checking inventory, and tried not to think about what was waiting for them at the end of this journey. The bond was stronger now, a constant presence in her chest that pulsed with every mile they traveled. She could feel Aldrin at the front of the column, could sense his tension and his focus, and sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she could almost see through his eyes, could feel the weight of command pressing down on him. It was disorienting and invasive, and yet she found herself seeking it out, reaching for that connection when the fear grew too strong. It was the only thing that made her feel less alone. On the 3rd night, as they sat around a fire eating dried meat and hard bread, Elias leaned closer and spoke quietly. "How are you holding up?" Ayla glanced at him, then looked back at the flames. "I'm fine." "You're a terrible liar," Elias said, but there was no judgment in his tone, only kindness. "It's all right to be scared, you know. Everyone here is scared, even His Majesty, though he'd never admit it." "I'm not scared of the fighting," Ayla said, which was not entirely true, but felt true enough. "I'm scared of what happens after. If Dorian is as dangerous as everyone says, if he really wants to use humans as weapons, then what does that mean for people like me? What does it mean for all the humans living in the kingdom?" Elias was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know," he admitted. "Dorian's always been ambitious, always believed that strength was the only thing that mattered. If he's experimenting on humans, if he's trying to find ways to weaponize them, then he's crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. And that means we have to stop him, no matter the cost." "Even if it means more people die?" Ayla asked. "Even then," Elias said quietly. "Because if we don't stop him now, the death toll will be far greater. Dorian won't be satisfied with just overthrowing Aldrin. He'll want to reshape the entire kingdom, and anyone who doesn't fit his vision will be expendable. Humans especially." Ayla shivered, pulling her cloak tighter around her shoulders. She thought about the people she had known in Ravenhill, the miners and merchants and laborers who lived their lives on the margins, always one bad day away from disaster. They had no power, no voice, no protection beyond what little the king's laws provided. And if Dorian succeeded, even that would disappear. "I won't let that happen," she said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. Elias looked at her, one eyebrow raised. "How do you plan to stop it?" "I don't know," Ayla admitted. "But I'm here, aren't I? I chose to come. That has to count for something." Elias smiled, and there was warmth in it. "It counts for a great deal," he said. More than you know. They reached the foothills of the eastern mountains on the 5th day, and the scouts reported back that they were close to Dorian's stronghold. The fortress was built into the side of a mountain, a natural defensive position that would be difficult to assault. Aldrin called a halt and gathered his commanders to discuss strategy, and Ayla watched from a distance as they pored over maps and argued about approach angles and weak points. That evening, Aldrin came to the medical camp. Ayla was helping Kendra sort through supplies when she felt the bond pulse sharply, and she looked up to see him standing at the edge of the firelight. He looked exhausted, his face drawn and his shoulders tight with tension. But when his eyes found hers, some of that tension eased. "Can I speak with you?" he asked. Ayla nodded, setting down the bandages she had been counting, and followed him away from the camp, into the relative privacy of the trees. They walked in silence for a moment, and Ayla felt the bond thrumming between them, stronger than it had ever been. "We attack tomorrow," Aldrin said finally. "At dawn. Dorian knows we're coming, so there's no point in trying to surprise him. We'll have to take the fortress by force." "How bad will it be?" Ayla asked. "Bad," Aldrin said bluntly. "He's fortified and his wolves are loyal. We'll take casualties, possibly heavy ones, but we don't have a choice. If we give him more time, he'll only grow stronger." Ayla nodded, her chest tight. "What do you need me to do?" "Stay with Elias," Aldrin said. "Stay at the rear, away from the fighting. I know you want to help, but the best thing you can do is stay safe. If something happens to you—" He trailed off, his jaw tightening. "I can't focus on the battle if I'm worried about you." "I'll stay with Elias," Ayla promised. "But Aldrin, if things go wrong, if Dorian breaks through, you need to know that I'm not just going to run. I'm not going to abandon the wounded." Aldrin turned to face her fully, and in the dim light, his eyes seemed to glow faintly. "I know," he said. "And that's one of the things He stopped, shaking his head. "Just be careful, please." "You too," Ayla said. And before she could think better of it, she reached out and touched his arm. The contact sent a jolt through the bond, and she saw his eyes widen slightly. "Come back," she said quietly. "Whatever happens, come back." Aldrin covered her hand with his touch warm and solid. "I will," he said. "I promise." They stood there for a moment, the bond humming between them, and Ayla realized that something had shifted. The anger and resentment that had defined her feelings for him had not disappeared, but they were no longer the only thing she felt. There was something else now, something fragile and tentative, like the first shoots of green breaking through snow. She did not know what to call it. She was not sure she wanted to name it, but it was there, undeniable and real. Aldrin seemed to sense it too because he smiled, a small, genuine smile that transformed his face. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow is going to be a long day." Ayla nodded and watched as he walked back toward the command tent, his figure disappearing into the darkness. She stood there for a moment longer, her hand still warm from where he had touched it, and then returned to the medical camp, her mind racing. She did not sleep that night. None of them did. The camp was alive with tension, with the quiet movements of soldiers checking weapons and armor, with whispered prayers to gods Ayla did not know. She sat by the fire with Elias and the other healers, preparing supplies, organizing tools, doing everything she could to keep her hands busy and her mind occupied. But as the hours crept toward dawn, the fear grew sharper, more insistent, and she found herself reaching for the bond, seeking the reassurance of Aldrin's presence. He was awake too, she realized. She could feel him moving through the camp, speaking with his soldiers, radiating a calm confidence that belied the danger they were about to face. And beneath it, she could feel his fear, not for himself, but for them, for all of them. It was a burden he carried alone, and for the first time, Ayla understood the weight of what it meant to be king. When the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, the army assembled. Aldrin stood at the front, his armor gleaming dully in the gray light, and addressed his troops. His voice carried across the camp, steady and commanding, and Ayla felt the bond pulse with every word. "Today, we face a traitor," Aldrin said. "A man who has turned his back on everything we stand for, who has chosen ambition over loyalty, cruelty over honor, He believes that strength means domination, that power means control. But he is wrong. True strength lies in unity, in protecting those who cannot protect themselves, in standing together against those who would tear us apart. Today, we fight not just for the throne, but for the future of this kingdom, for every wolf, every human, every person who calls this land home. And we will not fail. A roar went up from the troops, a sound that shook the air, and Ayla felt tears sting her eyes. She did not know when she had started to believe in him, when she had stopped seeing him as the king who had taken her choice, and started seeing him as a man worth following. But she believed in him now, and that terrified her almost as much as the battle ahead. The army moved out, and Ayla climbed into the medical wagon with Elias and the others. They followed at a distance, staying well back from the front lines, and as they crested a ridge and saw Dorian's fortress for the first time, Ayla's breath caught in her throat. It was massive, a structure of dark stone that seemed to grow out of the mountain itself. High walls surrounded it, studded with towers and battlements, and Ayla could see figures moving on the ramparts, wolves preparing for the assault. The approach was steep and narrow, offering little cover, and she could see why Aldrin had been so concerned. This was not going to be a quick battle. This was going to be a siege. The fighting began with a volley of arrows from the fortress walls, and Aldrin's troops raised their shields, forming a wall as they advanced. Ayla watched from the medical wagon, her hands clenched into fists, as the soldiers pushed forward, inch by bloody inch. The sound was deafening. The clash of steel on steel, the howls of wolves, the screams of the wounded. And through it all, she could feel Aldrin, could sense him at the front of the charge, his presence a blazing beacon in the chaos. The first wounded arrived within the hour. Elias barked orders, directing the flow of bodies, and Ayla threw herself into the work, her hands moving on instinct. She cleaned wounds and applied bandages. She set broken bones and administered pain relief, and she tried not to think about the fact that each soldier she treated was a person with a life, with a family, with dreams that might never be realized. The hours blurred together. More wounded came, a steady stream that never seemed to stop, and Ayla worked until her hands ached and her back screamed in protest. She saw injuries she had only read about in books, wounds that should have been fatal, but that the wolves survived through sheer stubborn will. She saw death, too, soldiers who slipped away despite everything she and Elias tried, and each loss felt like a stone added to the weight in her chest. And through it all, she felt the bond, felt Aldrin fighting, felt his exhaustion and his determination, and his fear. She reached for it when the horror grew too great, used it as an anchor to keep herself grounded, and prayed that he would survive. The battle raged for hours, the sun climbing high and then beginning its descent, and still the fortress held. Aldrin's troops had breached the outer walls, but the fighting had moved inside, into the narrow corridors and chambers where the advantage shifted to the defenders. Ayla could feel Aldrin's frustration, could sense the toll the battle was taking on him, and she wanted desperately to help, to do something more than just patch up the wounded and send them back into the fray. And then, as the sun began to set, everything changed. A group of soldiers came running toward the medical camp, their faces panicked, and Ayla's heart sank as she saw that they were carrying someone. Elias rushed forward, and Ayla followed, her stomach churning. And then she saw who it was. Theron, Aldrin's commander, the man who had led the assault on the fortress gates. His armor was dented and bloodied, and there was a deep gash across his chest that was bleeding profusely. Elias swore and shouted for help, and they laid Theron on one of the tables, his breathing shallow and labored. "What happened?" Elias demanded as he cut away Theron's armor. "Ambush!" one of the soldiers gasped. "Dorian's forces hit us from the side. Commander Theron held them off so the rest of us could retreat, but he took a blade to the chest. We need to get him stable. Or His Majesty. His Majesty will have to wait," Elias snapped. "Hold him down. This is going to hurt." Ayla moved to help, her hands shaking as she applied pressure to the wound. The blood was hot and slick under her fingers, and she could feel Theron's pulse fluttering weakly. This was bad. This was very bad. And if Theron died, it would be a devastating blow to Aldrin and the entire army. Elias worked quickly, his hands steady despite the urgency, and Ayla assisted as best she could, handing him tools and supplies, holding Theron still when he thrashed. The minutes stretched into eternity, and Ayla felt the bond pulse sharply, a wave of alarm that told her Aldrin had felt Theron's injury through the connection between Commander and King. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Elias stepped back, his face grim, but his eyes cautiously hopeful. "He'll live," he said, "but he's out of the fight. We need to keep him stable and hope there's no infection." Ayla sagged with relief, her hands still trembling. She looked down at Theron's unconscious form and felt a surge of gratitude that they had saved him. One less death, one less loss. But the relief was short-lived, because at that moment, a runner came sprinting into the camp, his face pale. "Dorian's forces have broken through the eastern line," he gasped. "They're heading this way. His Majesty says to evacuate the medical camp immediately." Ayla's blood ran cold. She looked at Elias, who had gone very still. "How much time do we have?" he asked. "Minutes," the runner said. "Maybe less. They're moving fast." Elias swore and turned to the other healers. "Start packing. Take only what we can carry. Kendra, Orin, help me get the wounded onto the wagons. We need to move now." Ayla's mind raced. There were at least 30 wounded soldiers in the camp, some of them too injured to move, and only 3 wagons. They would not be able to take everyone. Someone would have to stay behind. Someone would have to make the impossible choice of who lived and who died. And then, through the bond, she felt Aldrin. He was coming. He was fighting his way back toward the medical camp, toward her, and she could feel his desperation, his terror at the thought of Dorian's forces reaching her. She made a decision. "Elias," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "Take the wounded and go. I'll stay behind and buy you time." Elias stared at her, his eyes wide. "Absolutely not. If you stay, you die. Dorian will—" "I know what Dorian will do," Ayla interrupted. "But if I don't stay, you won't make it out. Someone has to slow them down, and I'm the only one who doesn't have to fight. I can talk to them. I can stall." "Ayla, this is insane," Elias said, his voice rising. "His Majesty will never forgive me if I let you." "He'll forgive you," Ayla said, and she reached out and squeezed Elias's hand. "Because I'm choosing this. Tell him that. Tell him I chose this." Elias looked at her for a long moment, and then, reluctantly, he nodded. "You have 5 minutes," he said. "If you're not out by then, I'm sending soldiers back for you." "Deal," Ayla said. And then Elias was moving, shouting orders, and the camp erupted into controlled chaos as they loaded the wounded and prepared to evacuate. Ayla stood at the edge of the camp, her heart pounding, and watched as the wagons rolled away into the gathering dusk. She could hear the sounds of battle growing closer, could see torches moving through the trees, and she knew that Dorian's forces would be here within minutes. She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and waited. When they came, it was like a wave crashing over the camp. Wolves in dark armor, their eyes glowing in the firelight, their weapons drawn. They spread out, searching the tents and the supply wagons, and when they found nothing, their leader stepped forward. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with silver streaks in his dark hair, and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. He looked at Ayla with cold, calculating eyes, and she knew without being told that this was Dorian Valtor. "Well?" he said, his voice smooth and mocking. "What do we have here? A little human all alone. How very convenient." Ayla forced herself to meet his gaze, even though every instinct screamed at her to run. "They're gone," she said. "You're too late." Dorian smiled, and it was a terrible thing. "Oh, I don't think so," he said. "You see, I wasn't looking for the wounded. I was looking for you." He stepped closer, and Ayla felt the bond flare in her chest, a desperate warning. "Ayla Morgan, the king's little human mate, the one who saved his life. Do you have any idea how valuable you are?" Ayla's hands clenched into fists. "I'm not going anywhere with you." "I don't recall asking," Dorian said. and then he nodded to his soldiers. "Take her." Ayla tried to run, but they were faster. Hands grabbed her arms, wrenching them behind her back, and she cried out as pain shot through her still healing wound. She struggled, kicking and thrashing, but it was useless. They were too strong, and she was only human. And then, through the bond, she felt Aldrin. He was close, so close, and his fury was a living thing, a fire that burned through the connection between them. She reached for it, clung to it, and screamed his name with everything she had. "Aldrin!" Dorian laughed. "Oh, he'll come," he said. "They always do. And when he does, I'll have everything I need to bring him to his knees." Ayla felt the world tilt as they dragged her toward the trees, felt the bond stretching thin and painful, and she knew that Aldrin was fighting to reach her, that he would tear through anyone who stood in his way. But she also knew that Dorian was counting on that this had been the plan all along. And as the darkness closed in around her, as Dorian's soldiers carried her away from the camp and deeper into the mountains, Ayla realized that she had just become the weapon Dorian needed to destroy the king, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Ayla woke to darkness and the smell of damp stone. Her head throbbed, and when she tried to move, she found her wrists bound behind her back with rough rope that bit into her skin. She was lying on a cold floor, and when she forced her eyes open, she saw that she was in some kind of cell, the walls carved from rock and lit only by a single torch flickering in a bracket outside the iron bars. She pushed herself upright, wincing as pain flared in her side. The wound from the arrow had not fully healed, and the rough treatment from Dorian's soldiers had reopened it. She could feel blood seeping through the bandages, warm and sticky, and nausea rolled through her stomach. She took a slow breath, trying to steady herself, and assessed her situation. She was alone. The cell was small, perhaps 6 feet by 8, with no windows and no furniture except for the straw scattered across the floor. The door was solid iron with a small barred opening at eye level, and beyond it, she could hear voices, distant and indistinct. She had no idea where she was or how long she had been unconscious. Hours, maybe, or days. The bond pulsed in her chest, sharp and insistent, and she realized that Aldrin was looking for her. She could feel his desperation, his rage, and beneath it, a fear so profound it made her own terror seem small by comparison. He was coming for her. She knew that with absolute certainty, but she also knew that was exactly what Dorian wanted. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, growing louder, and Ayla forced herself to sit up straighter, to look composed even though her heart was pounding. The footsteps stopped outside her cell, and a key rattled in the lock. The door swung open, and Dorian stepped inside, flanked by 2 guards. He looked at her with that same cold, calculating expression, and Ayla met his gaze without flinching. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her afraid. "You're awake," Dorian said. "Good. I was beginning to think my men had been too rough with you. We need you alive, after all." "For what?" Ayla asked, her voice hoarse. Dorian smiled. "For the ritual, of course. You see, the bond you share with Aldrin is more than just a romantic connection. It's a magical one, tied to the royal bloodline. And that magic can be redirected. With the right methods, with the right catalyst, I can use your bond to sever Aldrin's connection to the throne, to strip him of his power and his authority, to make him nothing." Ayla's blood ran cold. "You're insane." "Am I?" Dorian crouched down in front of her, his eyes gleaming. "The royal bloodline has held this kingdom together for generations, but it's built on a lie. The idea that one family, one line of wolves, has the right to rule over all others. I'm going to break that lie. And you, my dear, are going to help me do it." "I'll die first," Ayla said. "You might," Dorian agreed. "The ritual is unpredictable, but that's a risk I'm willing to take. Because even if you die, the bond will break and Aldrin will be crippled. Either way, I win." He stood and turned toward the door. "We begin at dawn," he said. "I suggest you make peace with whatever gods you believe in." And then he was gone, the door clanging shut behind him, and Ayla was alone again in the darkness. She closed her eyes and reached for the bond, reaching for Aldrin with everything she had. She did not know if he could feel her, if he could sense what she was trying to tell him, but she pushed the message through the connection anyway. I'm here. I'm alive. Don't come alone. For a moment, there was nothing. And then, like a whisper in her mind, she felt his response. I'm coming. Hold on. Tears slipped down her cheeks, and she did not bother to wipe them away. She had been so angry at him for claiming her, for taking her choice. But now, in this dark cell with death looming over her, she realized that the bond was the only thing keeping her sane. It was a lifeline, a promise that she was not alone, that someone cared whether she lived or died. She thought about the moment she had thrown herself in front of that arrow. She had not known Aldrin then. She had not known anything except that she could not let another person die. And now, sitting here in the darkness, she understood that maybe that had been the moment everything changed. Not when Aldrin had given her his blood, not when the bond had formed, but in that single instant when she had chosen to act, when she had decided that one life mattered more than her own safety. Maybe that was what it meant to be brave. Not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. She did not know how much time passed. The torch outside her cell burned down and was replaced by a guard she never saw. She drifted in and out of an uneasy sleep, her dreams filled with fire and blood and the sound of Aldrin's voice calling her name. And through it all, the bond pulsed steadily, a reminder that he was out there, that he was coming, that she just had to hold on a little longer. When the door opened again, it was not Dorian who entered. It was one of his soldiers, a young wolf with nervous eyes. He set a tin plate on the floor, a meager portion of bread and water, and turned to leave. But Ayla spoke before he could go. "Why are you following him?" she asked. The soldier paused, his hand on the door. "I don't have a choice." "Everyone has a choice," Ayla said. "You could walk away. You could refuse to be part of this." The soldier looked at her, and for a moment, she saw doubt flicker in his eyes. But then he shook his head. "You don't understand. Dorian promised us a future. A kingdom where we don't have to bow to a king who doesn't care about us, who lets humans live among us like equals when they should be serving us. He promised strength. Strength built on cruelty isn't strength," Ayla said quietly. "It's just fear dressed up as power, and it never lasts." The soldier stared at her for a long moment, and then he left without another word. Ayla sat back against the wall, her chest tight. She did not know if her words had made any difference, but she had to try. She had to believe that not everyone who followed Dorian was beyond saving. Dawn came too quickly. The guards returned, hauling her to her feet and dragging her out of the cell. She stumbled, her legs weak from hours of sitting, and they pulled her down a long corridor, up a flight of stairs, and into a large chamber that had been carved into the heart of the mountain. It was a ritual space, she realized with growing horror. The walls were covered in symbols she did not recognize, drawn in what looked like dried blood, and in the center of the room was a stone altar. Torches burned in brackets around the perimeter, casting flickering shadows, and standing near the altar was Dorian, dressed in dark robes and holding a blade that gleamed in the firelight. Ayla tried to pull away, but the guards held her fast. They forced her toward the altar, and she saw now that there were chains bolted to the stone, iron manacles waiting for her wrists and ankles. Panic clawed at her chest, and she struggled with everything she had, but it was useless. They were too strong. They chained her to the altar, the metal cold against her skin, and Dorian approached, the blade held loosely in his hand. "It's nothing personal," he said, almost conversationally. "You seem like a decent enough woman, but you're a symbol, and symbols have power. By breaking you, I break the bond. And by breaking the bond, I break the king. Aldrin will kill you for this," Ayla said, her voice shaking but defiant. "Perhaps," Dorian said, "but by the time he arrives, it will be too late. The ritual will be complete, and he'll be powerless to stop me." He raised the blade, and Ayla saw the runes carved into the metal, saw the way they seemed to glow faintly in the torchlight. "This won't take long." And then, before he could bring the blade down, the door exploded inward. Aldrin came through like a force of nature, his eyes blazing gold, his claws extended, and his roar shook the very walls of the chamber. He was covered in blood, his armor dented and torn, and behind him came his warriors. Theron somehow on his feet despite his injuries, Marina with her sword drawn, and dozens of others, all of them moving with the coordinated precision of a pack on the hunt. Dorian's soldiers tried to form a defensive line, but they were too slow. Aldrin tore through them, his focus singular, his rage absolute, and Ayla felt the bond flare so brightly it was almost painful. He was coming for her. Nothing else mattered. Dorian snarled and raised the blade, aiming for Ayla's heart, but before he could strike, Aldrin was on him. The two wolves collided with brutal force, and the blade went skittering across the floor. They fought with a savagery that was terrifying to witness. Claws and teeth and raw strength, and the chamber echoed with their snarls. Ayla pulled at the chains, trying desperately to free herself, and then someone was beside her. Elias. He had come with the others, and he was working at the manacles with a set of picks, his hands steady despite the chaos around them. "I told you I'd come back for you," he said, and there was a grim smile on his face. "I knew you would," Ayla gasped, and then the manacles clicked open, and she was free. Elias pulled her off the altar, and she stumbled, her legs weak, but he caught her. "Can you walk?" "I can run," Ayla said, and she meant it, but she did not run. She could not. Because Aldrin was still fighting Dorian, and she could feel through the bond that he was hurt, that Dorian had landed blows that would have killed a lesser wolf. She watched as they circled each other, both of them bleeding, both of them exhausted, and she knew that this fight could go either way. Dorian lunged, his claws aimed at Aldrin's throat, and Aldrin dodged, but not quite fast enough. The claws raked across his shoulder, and he staggered, blood pouring from the wound. Dorian grinned, sensing victory, and raised his hand for the killing blow. And then Ayla saw it. The ritual blade, lying on the floor a few feet away. She did not think. She just moved. She ran, scooped up the blade, and before Dorian could bring his claws down, she drove the blade into his back with every ounce of strength she had. Dorian roared, his body convulsing, and Aldrin did not hesitate. He lunged forward and closed his jaws around Dorian's throat, and there was a sickening crack. Dorian went limp, his body collapsing to the floor, and the chamber fell silent. Ayla stood there, the blade still clutched in her trembling hands, and stared at what she had done. She had killed someone. She had taken a life. And the weight of it crashed over her like a wave, stealing her breath and making her knees buckle. Aldrin was there instantly, catching her before she could fall. He pulled her against his chest, his arms wrapping around her, and she felt the bond surge, warm and reassuring and alive. "You're safe," he murmured, his voice rough. "You're safe. I have you." Ayla buried her face in his chest and let herself break. She cried for the fear, for the pain, for the horror of what she had just done. She cried for the life she had lost and the life she had found, for the bond she had resented, and the man she had come to care for. And Aldrin held her through all of it, his presence solid and unwavering, his hands gentle despite the blood and the violence. When the tears finally subsided, Ayla pulled back and looked up at him. His face was bruised and bloodied, his armor shredded, but his eyes were soft as they looked at her. "You came," she said. "Of course I came," Aldrin said. Did you think I wouldn't? I was afraid you'd be too late, Ayla admitted. I'll always come for you, Aldrin said, and the conviction in his voice made her chest tighten. Always. No matter what. Ayla reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. I know, she said quietly. I believe you. And in that moment, with Dorian dead at their feet and the battle won, Ayla realized that the bond was no longer something she resented. It was something she had chosen, just as surely as she had chosen to throw herself in front of that arrow. She had chosen to trust Aldrin, to let herself care for him, and that choice had set her free in ways she had never thought possible. Let's go home, she said. Aldrin smiled, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Yes, he said. Let's go home. The journey back to Blackthorn Keep took longer than the journey out. The army was battered and exhausted, and they moved slowly, carrying their wounded and their dead. But there was a sense of relief that permeated everything, a knowledge that the threat had been neutralized, that Dorian and his rebellion were finished. Ayla rode with Elias again, but this time Aldrin rode beside them, refusing to leave her side. They did not talk much. They did not need to. The bond said everything that words could not, a constant hum of reassurance and connection. When they finally reached the keep, the sun was setting, casting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Ayla stood in the courtyard, looking up at the fortress that had once felt like a prison, and realized that it felt different now. It felt like a place where she could belong, a place where she could build a life. Aldrin came to stand beside her, and she reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. What happens now? She asked. Now, Aldrin said, we rebuild, we heal, and we figure out how to move forward together. Together, Ayla repeated, and the word felt right. It felt like a promise. If you'll have me, Aldrin said, and there was a vulnerability in his voice that she had never heard before. I know I took your choice before, but I'm giving it back to you now. You can stay, or you can go. You can be my queen, or you can be free. Whatever you choose, I'll support it. Ayla looked at him, at this man who had fought through an army to save her, who had given her his blood and his protection and, slowly, his heart. She thought about the girl she had been, broken and afraid, running from a life that had nearly destroyed her. And she thought about the woman she was now, scarred but strong, capable of making her own choices. I choose to stay, she said. Not because of the bond, not because I have to, but because I want to. Because you've shown me that I'm worth protecting, that I'm worth caring for. And because I think I'm falling in love with you. Aldrin's eyes widened, and then he was pulling her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was gentle and fierce and full of promise. The bond flared between them, bright and warm, and Ayla felt it settle into place, no longer a burden but a gift. When they finally pulled apart, Aldrin rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said. I think I've loved you since the moment you threw yourself in front of that arrow. You're the bravest person I've ever known. I'm not brave, Ayla said. I'm just stubborn. Aldrin laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "Then I love your stubborn heart." They stood there in the courtyard, wrapped in each other's arms, as the last light faded from the sky. And Ayla knew that this was only the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, obstacles to overcome, scars that would take time to heal. But she also knew that she would not face them alone. She had found her strength. She had found her voice. And she had found a partner who would stand beside her, not in front of her, for the rest of their lives. In the weeks that followed, Ayla and Aldrin completed the mate bond in a private ceremony attended only by their closest friends. Elias performed the ritual, binding their hands with a silver cord and speaking the ancient words that had been used for generations. When Aldrin marked her, his teeth gentle on her neck, Ayla felt the bond solidify into something permanent and unbreakable, and she knew that she had finally found the home she had been searching for all her life. She took her place as queen beside Aldrin, not as a figurehead, but as a true partner. She used her position to advocate for the humans living in the kingdom, to ensure that they had protections and rights, that they were treated with dignity and respect. And slowly, over time, the wolves began to accept her, to see her not as a weakness, but as a strength, as proof that their king valued all his people, not just those with power. Ayla never forgot where she had come from. She never forgot the girl who had slept in a shed and lived in fear, who had run until her feet bled and thought she would never be safe. But she also did not let that girl define her. She took the pain and the scars and used them to build something better, something stronger. And when she stood on the battlements of Blackthorn Keep, looking out over the kingdom that was now hers to protect, she felt at peace. She had chosen this life. She had chosen this love. And she would spend the rest of her days proving that the choice had been the right one. Aldrin joined her, his hand finding hers, and they stood together in silence, two souls bound by fate and strengthened by choice. The wind carried the scent of snow and pine, and in the distance, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging. But Ayla had changed. She was no longer the broken girl who had arrived in Ravenhill with nothing but fear in her heart. She was a queen. She was a survivor. And she was, finally, truly free. "Thank you," she said quietly. And Aldrin looked at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. "For what?" "For giving me a reason to live," Ayla said. "For showing me that I was worth saving." Aldrin pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You saved yourself," he said. "I was just lucky enough to be there when you did." Ayla smiled, leaning into his embrace, and for the first time in her life, she believed him. She had saved herself. She had found her strength. And she had built a life worth living. The future stretched out before them, uncertain and full of challenges, but also full of hope. And as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, Ayla knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. She had stepped in front of an arrow and found her destiny, and she would never regret it. Not for a single moment.